"Get that filthy thing off my brother's grave." Ethan Whitmore's voice rang through the freezing morning air, making Annie jump. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to upset anyone." Annie slowly rose from the dew-soaked grass. The cold had seeped through the knees of her dark dress, but it was the humiliation that made her tremble most. Instinctively, she pulled the sides of the coat tightly around herself. "Did you hear me?" Ethan shouted. "Take off that filthy coat and get away from my brother's grave right now." His eyes were fixed on the coat Annie was wearing. It was a heavy brown canvas work jacket, hanging loosely from her small shoulders. One sleeve had been mended by hand with uneven stitches, and the left shoulder bore a large, dark burn mark, as though flames had brushed against it many years ago. "You should leave," Victoria added coldly. Her eyes traveled from Annie's worn boots to the frayed, scorched coat around her shoulders. "This is a private family memorial." Annie turned back toward the name engraved on the headstone. Daniel Whitmore, private family. Those two words cut deeper than Ethan's anger. Standing near Victoria, Noah shifted slightly forward. "Dad," he said hesitantly. "She brought flowers. Maybe we should ask why she came, before we throw her out." Ethan did not take his eyes off Annie. "Noah, this does not concern you." But she was only praying. Victoria shot Noah a warning look. A grave does not become public property simply because a stranger chooses to kneel beside it. Annie bent down and picked up the small wooden cross her mother had sent with her. Her fingers trembled as she closed them around it. She left the bouquet of white daisies where it was, at the base of the headstone. She could not bear to take the flowers away from her father simply because these strangers did not understand why she had placed them there. "I'll leave," Annie said softly. She took one step back from the grave, but Ethan's expression remained cold. It had not softened in the slightest. "Before you go, tell me why you were kneeling at my brother's grave." Annie stopped. She squeezed the wooden cross in her palm until its edge pressed painfully into her skin. "This coat belonged to my father," she said quietly. Ethan frowned. "What did you just say?" "The coat." Annie touched the scorched shoulder. "It belonged to my father." Ethan stepped closer. The irritation on his face slowly shifted into suspicion mixed with disbelief. "Your father?" he asked. "And who exactly was your father?" Annie turned toward the headstone. Then she raised her hand and pointed to the name carved into the cold stone. "Him," she said. "Daniel Whitmore." For several seconds, no one spoke. A cold wind swept through the rows of headstones, stirring the bare branches above them. Then Ethan looked at the scorched coat Annie was wearing and let out a bitter, unpleasant laugh. "What the hell is going on here?" he said. "Good Lord. She comes here dressed in rags, lays flowers on my brother's grave, and now she claims Daniel was her father?" Annie's cheeks burned. Victoria moved closer to Ethan. "This is exactly why private memorials should have security present." Ethan shook his head, still looking at Annie as though her grief were nothing more than a clumsy performance. "Can you believe this?" he said to Victoria and Noah. "How touching. A sick mother, a grieving young girl, a ragged old coat, all appearing on the very anniversary of my brother's death." He took a deep breath, then pretended to choke back tears, lifting a gloved hand to wipe his eyes. "Oh, forgive me. I need a moment to compose myself. This story is truly overwhelming." "Dad, stop," Noah said quietly, his voice filled with embarrassment. Annie stood perfectly still, clutching the wooden cross against her chest with both hands. Her father had always told her that cruelty revealed far more about the person who inflicted it than the person forced to endure it. But standing there, being mocked in front of her father's grave, Annie realized that knowing that did not make the pain hurt any less. "I'm not making this up," she said. The mocking smile vanished from Ethan's lips. "My brother did not have a family," he replied coldly. "Daniel lived alone for more than 20 years. He kept to himself. He never brought a wife home. He never mentioned any children, and now a girl wearing a scorched old coat appears and claims to be his daughter? It is ridiculous." "He did not live alone," Annie said. Her voice trembled, but her eyes remained fixed on Ethan. "He lived with my mother. He lived with me." Victoria slowly folded her gloved hands in front of her. "A dead man cannot rise from his grave to dispute a claim that happens to be convenient." Annie looked at her. "I did not come here to ask for anything. My mother is sick. She could not come to visit her husband today, so she sent me in her place." Ethan's jaw tightened. "My brother was never married." "Yes," Annie answered quietly. Not in any way your family knew about. Noah slowly stepped forward. Dad, what if you really didn't know? Ethan turned sharply toward his son. I knew my brother. Annie's eyes glistened with tears, but she refused to wipe them away in front of the people humiliating her. Maybe you only knew the part of his life he allowed your family to see. The words came out more painfully than Annie had intended. Ethan stared at her, his face darkening once again. Leave, he said. Now. Annie glanced back at the grave. In her mind, she could hear her mother's ragged cough from that morning. She remembered Grace's thin, trembling hands placing the old coat in her arms. Take it to your father, her mother had said. He has waited long enough. Annie drew in a shaky breath. Slowly, she took the canvas coat from her shoulders and held it against her chest for a moment. Without its heavy protection, the bitter wind immediately cut through her thin dress. I brought this for him, Annie said. Whether you believe me or not does not change who it belongs to. She stepped toward the headstone and carefully placed Daniel's coat at the base of the grave, beside the white daisies and the small wooden cross. Her fingers gently brushed over the scorch mark on its shoulder, the same way Grace had done before handing it to her. Ethan's face flushed with anger. No, absolutely not. He rushed forward and snatched the coat from the foot of the headstone before Annie could rise. I told you not to put that filthy thing on my brother's grave. Please, Annie cried, reaching for it. Don't pull it like that. It belonged to him. But Ethan jerked the coat back roughly. The already worn hem suddenly tore open. The inner lining flipped outward toward him, revealing a small leather patch sewn inside near the chest. Words had been carved into the leather by hand. The lettering was uneven, almost clumsy, but clear enough that there could be no mistake. Daniel and Grace. Annie are light. Ethan froze. The coat sagged between his hands. For that brief moment, the cemetery seemed to vanish around him. The rows of headstones, the wreaths, Victoria's voice, the watching guests, all of it faded away. Only one memory remained, one he had buried for many years. Daniel's voice echoed in his mind, warm and steady, just as it had been when they were young. Stay with me, Ethan. I will always protect you. Ethan stared at the scorch mark on the shoulder of the coat. Then he looked down at the names carved inside it. Daniel, Grace, Annie. Victoria was the first to speak. Ethan? He did not answer. Annie took one step toward him, her face wet with tears. That is my father's coat, she said. He wore it on the last night before he came home safely. Ethan's hands began to tremble. Grace, he whispered, his eyes still fixed on the leather patch sewn into the lining. Then he slowly raised his gaze to Annie. Who is Grace? Annie's voice caught in her throat. My mother, she said. The wife Daniel Whitmore kept hidden from your family. Ethan's face turned white. Annie looked toward her father's headstone as tears silently slipped down her cheeks. And I am his daughter. Victoria was the first to regain her composure. Ethan, give her the coat back, she said coldly. Anyone could sew a leather patch into an old jacket. It does not prove a thing. Annie reached for it. Please. Ethan looked at her trembling hand, then down at the scorched shoulder of the coat. The mocking expression had vanished from his face, but the damage his words had done was still written across Annie's pale features. Please give it back to me, she repeated, her voice catching. My mother trusted me with it. Ethan slowly released the coat. Annie immediately took it from him and pressed it against her chest, smoothing the torn lining with trembling fingers. Without the coat around her shoulders, the icy wind cut straight through her thin dress, but she did not put it back on right away. After the way Ethan had torn it from the grave, she felt as though his doubt and contempt had somehow clung to the old fabric. Noah stepped a little closer. Are you all right? Annie did not answer him. Her eyes remained fixed on Ethan. Ethan cleared his throat, as though it took all his strength to speak. You said your mother's name is Grace? Yes. And you said she was Daniel's wife? Annie tightened her hold on the coat. She is his wife, she answered. My father is gone. That does not mean their marriage never existed. Victoria's expression hardened immediately. You should be careful how you speak to us. No, Noah said quietly. She should not have to be. Victoria turned sharply toward him, but Ethan raised one hand to silence her without taking his eyes off Annie. Where is your mother now? At home. Why didn't she come here herself? Annie stared at him, unable to believe he could ask such a question, as though Grace had simply chosen not to attend her husband's memorial. My mother wanted to come, Annie said. She got dressed this morning. She made it from her bed to the living room before she could no longer breathe well enough to remain standing. Ethan said nothing. My mother has severe pulmonary fibrosis, Annie continued. Her lungs are badly scarred. Now she needs oxygen most of the day. Some mornings, she still has enough strength to warm up a bowl of soup for herself. Other mornings, she cannot cross our small apartment without stopping twice just to catch her breath. Annie's voice began to break. Today was one of the bad mornings. She lowered her eyes to the coat in her arms. All week, she kept telling herself she would be strong enough to come here. She laid out a dark blue dress over the back of a chair because it was the dress my father loved seeing her wear most. This morning, she even managed to put on one shoe before she started coughing so badly that I had to help her back into bed. Ethan glanced down at Daniel's headstone. So she asked you to come in her place, he said, his voice lower now. She asked me to bring flowers. She asked me to bring the wooden cross she keeps on her bedside table. Annie held the coat more tightly. She asked me to pray for my father because she no longer has the strength to kneel beside his grave herself. She lifted her eyes to Ethan, and she gave me this coat because it belonged to my father. Victoria looked toward the stone path winding between the graves, her expression suggesting that she was calculating how quickly this unpleasant encounter could be brought to an end. If Grace is ill, I am sorry to hear that, she said, but illness does not prove a marriage or a child. This is the Whitmore family burial ground. You cannot simply appear without warning and expect Mr. Whitmore to accept a claim like this. I do not expect anything from him, Annie replied. I did not even know any of you would be here. Ethan looked up at her. You did not know my family would visit Daniel on the anniversary of his death? I knew my father had relatives somewhere, Annie said, but my mother never spoke much about them. I only knew the name of the cemetery, the section, and the row because she wrote them down for me. That is all. Victoria gave a quiet, skeptical laugh. How convenient. Annie turned toward her. What part of this seems convenient to you, ma'am? Annie, Noah said gently, perhaps trying to spare her from having to defend herself any further in front of people who had already treated her so cruelly. But Annie had spent the past year watching her mother grow weaker in the small apartment, where Daniel's chair still sat untouched at the kitchen table, as though he might come home at any moment. She could not remain silent anymore. What do you think I came here for? Annie asked Victoria. Money? Photographs? Some kind of scene I could sell to the press? Victoria did not answer. Annie continued, her voice trembling with both anger and humiliation. I took 2 buses and walked nearly half a mile from the last stop to get here because my mother could not visit her husband's grave herself. I brought only 6 flowers because, after paying for her medication yesterday, that was all I could afford. Victoria's jaw tightened, but not a trace of shame appeared on her face. Ethan's face, however, showed it. His eyes slowly lowered to the coat Annie was holding against her chest. Daniel once put that coat around me, he said. Annie looked at him immediately. Ethan no longer sounded like an angry man. His voice had become distant, as though he were following the outline of a memory buried far too long. It was bitterly cold that night, he said. I do not remember much. I only remember lying on the ground, so cold I could not move. Daniel took off his coat, covered me with it, and told me to stay awake. Annie looked down at the scorched shoulder of the coat. That is the coat my father took off to cover you, she said softly. When he came home, he was still carrying it in his hands, but he was so cold he could no longer put it back on. Her words seemed to hollow something out inside Ethan. He made it home? Annie nodded. Barely. She turned toward Daniel's grave. The 6 white daisies she had brought trembled in the wind, one of them resting against the small wooden cross. My father was freezing, Annie said. His hands were shaking so badly he could not hold a glass of water by himself. My mother wanted to call an ambulance immediately, but he kept insisting that he was fine. She drew in a painful breath. He said his little brother was alive. He said that was what mattered. Ethan's face changed when he heard the words little brother. He really said that? Yes. Annie's voice grew quieter. A few hours later, my father collapsed in our kitchen. My mother found him on the floor. I called 911 while she tried to keep him awake. Noah covered his mouth for a moment, his eyes never leaving Annie. The doctors said that prolonged exposure to the extreme cold, along with the terrible strain on his body, contributed to the stroke, Annie continued. My father died at the hospital before sunrise. If Annie and her father's sacrifice touched your heart, please like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of truth, courage, and justice. Ethan stared at the headstone before him. For the past year, it had told him only one story, that Daniel had been a solitary man who died without leaving a family behind. Now, every word Annie spoke was shattering that story. Victoria drew in a deep breath. "That is enough." "No," Ethan said. His voice was quiet, but Victoria fell silent immediately. Ethan looked at Annie. "If Daniel truly was your father, why did he never tell me?" Annie shook her head faintly. Her face no longer showed only pain, but also the exhaustion of someone who had been forced to explain far too many things that should never have been doubted in the first place. "I do not know," she said. "My father never spoke about you. My mother never wanted to talk about the Whitmore family either." She looked from Ethan to Victoria, then back at the grave. "After what happened here today, I think I understand why." Noah stepped closer to his father. "Dad, you need to listen to her." Ethan was still shaken, but the doubt in his eyes had not completely disappeared. "I need more than a coat and a story." Annie flinched at the word story, as though everything she had just said about her mother, about her father's death, about the grief she had carried all the way to this cemetery, was still nothing more than a performance awaiting verification. Then Annie suddenly remembered the canvas shoulder bag hanging at her side. Her mother had insisted that she take it, even though Annie had said she only needed her phone and bus card. Slowly, she opened the bag. Beneath a packet of tissues and Grace's small prayer book, Annie's fingers touched a clear plastic envelope she had not placed there herself. She pulled it out. Through the transparent cover, Annie could see the edge of an old, slightly yellowed photograph. Behind it was an official certificate, carefully folded. Her breath caught. "My mother put this in my bag without telling." Victoria's eyes narrowed immediately. Ethan looked at the envelope in Annie's hand, then up at her face. Slowly, Annie opened it. Annie slipped one finger beneath the flap of the plastic envelope. For a moment, she could not bring herself to remove what was inside. Grace had placed it there without telling her, which meant her mother had known this could happen. She had known Annie might stand in front of strangers and be forced to prove that the man she loved as her father had truly been hers. The first thing Annie pulled out was a photograph. It was old enough for the corners to have softened. Daniel stood in front of the narrow brick building where Annie and Grace still lived. His hair darker then, one arm around Grace's waist. Grace was younger, smiling toward Daniel instead of the camera. In Daniel's other arm was a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket, her small face turned against his shirt. Annie held the picture toward Ethan. "That's my mother," she said, "and that's me." Ethan did not take it at first. His eyes stayed on Daniel's face, as if the photograph had reached across the years and struck him somewhere private. Then he removed one glove and accepted it by the edges. Noah moved beside him. "That is Uncle Daniel." Victoria glanced at the photograph, her expression tightening. "It shows Daniel with a woman and a child. It does not tell us who they were to him." Annie felt something inside her harden. "You really need it said in a way you can't ignore, don't you?" Victoria opened her mouth, but Ethan raised his hand. "Enough, Victoria." The words were not loud. Yet Victoria looked at him as though he had broken an agreement she believed had always existed between them. Ethan turned the photograph over. Written on the back in faded blue ink were the words, "Grace and Annie. My whole life in one picture, Daniel." His thumb moved once over the handwriting. "I know his writing," Ethan said quietly. Annie pulled the second document from the envelope. This one shook slightly in her hands. She unfolded it and held it out. "My birth certificate." Ethan looked at her, then took the paper. Noah read over his shoulder. Annie watched his eyes move down the page until they stopped. "Child, Annie Rose Whitmore. Mother, Grace Elaine Carter. Father, Daniel James Whitmore." Noah released a slow breath. "Dad." Ethan did not answer. He read the document again, then looked toward the grave as though the stone itself had withheld something from him. Victoria stepped closer. "Official copies can be requested and verified. We do not know where she got this." "My mother gave birth to me," Annie said. "That's where I got it. I am speaking about the document, and I am speaking about my life." Victoria's lips pressed together. Ethan still held the birth certificate. His face had lost the anger that first brought him across the grass. What remained was confusion, and under it, something beginning to look like shame. "How old are you?" he asked. Annie stared at him, old enough to know when someone is trying not to believe what is right in front of him. Noah looked down, hiding the briefest flicker of approval. Ethan accepted the rebuke without defending himself. He glanced again at Daniel's name on the certificate. "All these years," he said, "he had a daughter." "He raised a daughter," Annie replied. "There's a difference." That answer made Ethan close his eyes for a moment. The wind passed over the hill, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves and cut evergreen from the wreaths. Annie drew Daniel's coat around her again. The burned shoulder brushed her cheek, familiar and rough. Ethan looked at it. "That coat," he said. "Daniel had it the last time I saw him." Annie waited. Ethan seemed to have forgotten Victoria and Noah were standing there. His eyes remained on the scorched canvas. "It was bitter cold that night," he said, "colder than anyone expected. Daniel and I had gone out beyond the marked trail after an argument. Stubbornness on both sides. We lost our way before the weather turned." He swallowed. "I was not dressed for it. Daniel was. He kept telling me to walk, to keep moving, but my hands went numb. Then my legs stopped listening to me." Ethan looked at the coat on Annie's shoulders. "He took that coat off and wrapped it around me." Annie's grip tightened at the collar. "My father came home without it," she said. Ethan nodded faintly. "When help found us, I was wearing it. Daniel would not take it back. He said I needed it more." His voice lowered. He was shaking by then, but he kept saying he was fine. Annie's eyes stung. "He wasn't fine," she said. "He walked through our front door barely able to stand. My mother begged him to go to the hospital. He told her you were alive and that was enough." Ethan's mouth tightened. "A few hours later," Annie continued, "he collapsed in our kitchen. He had a stroke. My mother was on the floor with him when I called for an ambulance." Noah looked away toward the trees. Ethan stared at the photograph in his hand. "I knew he died after saving me. I never knew where he went afterward. I never knew anyone was waiting for him." "That doesn't mean no one was," Annie said. Victoria spoke carefully now. "Ethan, grief can make people connect things too quickly. This should be handled privately and properly. There may be legal implications." Annie gave a short, unbelieving laugh. "There it is." Victoria faced her. "Excuse me? My father is lying in the ground. My mother can barely breathe long enough to walk across a room. And you are worried my existence might become inconvenient on paper." "Annie," Ethan said. She turned on him. "No. You asked me why I was here. Now you know. I came because my mother couldn't make it to her husband's grave. I did not come to be laughed at. I did not come to be called a liar. And I did not come so somebody could decide whether I am acceptable enough to mourn my own father." Ethan lowered the birth certificate. "Your mother should be here," he said. Annie shook her head. "She wanted to be. I mean, she should never have had to stay away." The change in his voice caught Annie off guard. It was not enough to undo what he had said. It was not even close. But for the first time, Ethan sounded like a man seeing that the grave before him belonged to more sorrow than his own. Victoria reached for his arm. "Ethan, do not make promises in a cemetery because you feel guilty." He pulled his arm away. "I want to speak to Grace," Ethan said. Annie took the photograph and birth certificate from his hands, returning them carefully to the envelope. "My mother is ill," she said. "She doesn't need another person showing up to tell her Daniel didn't love her." Ethan looked at the burned coat, then at Annie. "No," he said. "She has already had enough of that." Annie did not know what to say to that. Ethan's voice had softened, but her body had not forgotten the sound of his laughter. The coat still felt warm, only because she held it so tightly against herself. Victoria looked from Ethan to Annie, her patience thinning. "We are standing over Daniel's grave discussing a claim that changes his entire estate, his reputation, and this family. Surely you understand why we cannot simply accept it because a young woman brought a photograph and a certificate." Noah turned toward her. "She didn't bring them to ambush us. She didn't even know they were in her bag." "That is what she says." Annie slipped the plastic envelope back inside her tote. "My mother put them there because she was afraid of exactly this. She knew I might meet people who would need paperwork before they let me say I loved my father." Victoria's expression remained fixed. "If your mother was Daniel's wife, why did she hide for a year?" Annie looked at her. "She didn't hide. She grieved. She never contacted Ethan." Maybe she did not want to ask permission to be someone's widow. Ethan's eyes closed briefly. Victoria turned toward him. Are you going to stand here and allow this girl to accuse your family of something she cannot possibly understand? I understand enough, Annie said. I understand my father was buried in a family plot without his wife or daughter being named on his stone. I understand my mother has cried over him in an apartment while people here brought flowers for a man they clearly did not know. That is enough, Ethan said. Annie thought he was speaking to her until he turned to Victoria. Stop questioning her as though she came here with an invoice. Victoria's face changed. I am trying to protect you. From what? My brother's child. From a decision made while you are shocked and guilty. I am guilty. The admission left everyone quiet. Ethan looked at Annie, then at the grave. I stood here and mocked her while at Coatℹ she was visiting her father. That happened before any document was shown to me, before I knew the coat, before I knew her name. He rubbed one hand over his mouth. Do not tell me guilt has nothing to do with this. Annie lowered her gaze. She had expected anger to continue until she found a way off the hill. She had not expected Ethan to turn it back on himself so quickly. Still, remorse did not make him safe. It only made him quieter. Noah moved toward the headstone and picked up one of the chrysanthemums that had tipped over in the grass. He brushed a piece of soil from its stem and returned it beside the wooden cross. I'm sorry, he said to Annie, for all of this. She nodded once. He had not been the one laughing, but she understood that sometimes decent people apologized for rooms they had not controlled. Ethan glanced at the flowers. Did your mother choose those? She likes chrysanthemums, Annie said. Dad used to bring them home from the grocery store because roses made her complain he had spent too much. A faint, broken smile touched Ethan's face. Daniel used to buy our mother daisies for the same reason. She wanted orchids. He said flowers should make a person happy, not nervous about the bill. For the first time, Annie heard something about her father from before she existed. It should have felt like a gift. Instead, it reminded her how much had been kept from everyone. Why did you think he lived alone? She asked. Ethan looked down the hill toward the rows of stones. Because he stopped coming home a long time ago. At first there were arguments with our parents. I was young enough to think they were none of my business and old enough to know Daniel was angry. Later, I was busy, then proud. He sent a card now and then. We spoke once every few years, never for long. And you never asked where he lived? Ethan accepted the question as he had accepted the others. No. Why not? He took longer to answer. Because I thought there would always be time to ask when it became convenient. Annie looked at Daniel's headstone. There wasn't. No, Ethan said. There wasn't. Victoria let out an impatient sigh. This conversation is becoming sentimental. And sentiment is not a plan. Ethan, Daniel's affairs were settled. If this is genuine, there will be records, legal procedures, claims against the estate. Claims? Noah said. She's his daughter. She may be his daughter. Until council reviews this, we do not know what Daniel intended. Annie took a step back. There it is again. You can hold my birth certificate and still talk, as though I am asking to break into his house. You are standing in the middle of a private family commemoration making a life-altering declaration. I was standing here alone, Annie replied. You came to me. Noah gave Victoria a look she could not dismiss. Ethan removed his other glove and folded both in his hand. Annie, I want to meet your mother. Not with lawyers. Not today if she is too ill. But I need to speak to her. Annie hesitated. Why? Because Daniel died saving my life. And I let a full year pass without knowing who had lost him because of it. He looked at the coat. Because your mother sent his coat here, and I called it filth before I understood I had once been kept alive inside it. Annie's eyes stung again. She hated how much she wanted those words to mean something. Victoria stepped closer to Ethan and lowered her voice, though not enough to keep Annie from hearing. You are not going into a stranger's home without advice. You have no idea what has been prepared for you. Ethan turned slowly. Prepared for me? A photograph, a certificate, a coat timed to appear on the anniversary of Daniel's death. Annie recoiled as though Victoria had pushed her. Noah's voice hardened. Mom, but Victoria continued. People do not approach families like ours accidentally. Ethan's face went still. She did not approach us. She approached her father's grave. The words ended the argument. Annie looked down at her tote. Her phone was vibrating inside it. She pulled it out and saw the name on the screen. Mom. For 1 second, Annie wanted to let it ring. She did not know how to tell Grace what had happened without making her sicker. Then she remembered her mother waiting alone in that apartment, wondering whether Daniel had received his flowers. Annie answered, "Hi, Mom." Grace's breathing came faintly through the phone before her voice did. "Baby, are you at the cemetery? Did you find him?" Annie looked at Ethan. He had heard the frailty in Grace's voice, and whatever color remained in his face seemed to disappear. "Yes," Annie said. "I found Dad." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Did you leave the flowers?" "I did." "And the cross?" "Yes." Another cough came through the phone, rough enough that Annie turned slightly away, as if she could protect her mother from being heard. Then Grace asked, "Is something wrong?" Annie closed her eyes. "Mom," she said, "there are people here. Daniel's brother is here." Silence answered her. Not surprise, not confusion, fear. When Grace finally spoke, her voice had fallen to a whisper. "Annie, come home." Annie pressed the phone tighter to her ear. "Mom, I'm okay. Come home," Grace repeated. Her breath caught between words. "You placed the flowers. That is all I asked you to do." Ethan stood a few feet away, watching Annie's face. Victoria had gone quiet, but her silence felt less like restraint than calculation. Noah kept his eyes on Annie, as if he understood that whatever came next belonged first to the woman on the other end of the call. "They saw the coat," Annie said. Grace did not answer. "Mom, he took it off the grave." It opened, and he saw the names inside. The sound that came through the phone was not quite a cough. It was the kind of breath a person takes when an old fear finally arrives at the door. "Did he hurt you?" The question made Annie close her eyes. "No." Ethan flinched as though the answer should not have required a pause. Grace said, "Then leave now, please. You do not owe them an explanation." Annie looked at the black stone, at the flowers bent slightly by the wind, at Daniel's name carved above an account of his life that had no room for either of them. "They already asked for one," she said. "I showed them my birth certificate." "Annie, you put it in my bag." Grace's voice weakened. "I put it there in case someone stopped you. I prayed no one would." Ethan stepped forward, slowly enough not to startle Annie. "May I speak to her?" Annie shook her head at once. "Please," he said. "I will not argue with her." Victoria touched his sleeve. "Ethan, that is unwise." He pulled his arm free. "For once, Victoria, I am not asking what is wise." Annie listened to her mother struggling to breathe on the other end of the line. She had never heard Grace frightened by a name before, but Ethan's had taken the strength out of her voice. "He wants to talk to you," Annie said. "No, he says he won't argue. Your father said many things about that family, baby. Not cruel things. That was not his way. But enough for me to know that their regret always comes after the damage." Ethan heard every word. His eyes dropped. Annie said softly, "I won't hand him the phone unless you say yes." Another cough folded Grace's answer in half. When she spoke again, she sounded tired rather than afraid. "Put him on speaker. You keep the phone in your hand." Annie tapped the screen. "You're on speaker," she said. Ethan removed his overcoat glove completely and tucked it into his pocket, a small, nervous gesture that made him look less like the man who had marched up the hill and more like someone uncertain where to put his hands. "Grace?" he said. There was a long pause. "Yes, I'm Ethan. I recognized your voice when Annie said your name." Ethan looked at the grave. "I did not know about you." "No," Grace said. "You did not. I didn't know Daniel was married. I didn't know he had a daughter. His daughter knew him. His wife knew him. Daniel was not unloved simply because your family was unaware of us." Noah lowered his head. Victoria's expression cooled further, but Ethan did not turn toward her. "I deserve that," he said. "Whether you deserve it is not what matters to me today. My child is standing in the cold at her father's grave after being treated like an intruder. Send her home." Annie looked away before Ethan could see fresh tears rise. He nodded once, though Grace could not see him. "I will. But before she leaves, I need to say something to you. I am sorry for the way I spoke to her." Grace did not answer immediately. Ethan continued, "I saw a young woman in worn clothes, wearing a burned coat, and I decided what she was before I asked who she was. Learning she is Daniel's daughter does not make what I said worse. It only makes it impossible for me to avoid seeing how wrong I already was. Victoria made a quiet sound of impatience. Ethan ignored it. Grace's reply came softer, but not warmer. Daniel spent his life believing people could become better than they had been raised to be. I loved that about him. I also watched it cost him. Annie looked at Ethan. The statement landed differently than anger would have. Ethan swallowed. Why did he never tell me? The line fell silent except for Grace's oxygen machine humming faintly in the background. When she answered, her words were measured. That is not a conversation I will have while my daughter is standing outside in the cold, and your wife is looking at her as though she wandered in from the street with a demand in her pocket. Victoria stepped forward. Mrs. Carter, no one is denying that you may have known Daniel, but you must understand the extraordinary nature of what is being asserted. Grace's breathing sharpened. Annie spoke first. Her name is Grace Whitmore. Victoria's eyes flicked toward her. Grace said through the phone, I did not take Daniel's name to borrow standing from it. I took it because I married the man. Whether your family approves a year after his death is of no interest to me. Noah turned slightly away, hiding a brief smile that carried no humor, only relief that Grace had not been made small by Victoria's voice. Ethan said, Grace, I want to come speak to you. When you are able. I need to understand what happened. What happened? Grace asked. Daniel loved a woman your family would never have chosen for him. He chose her anyway. Then he spent years making certain our daughter grew up knowing love was not something she needed permission to deserve. Annie covered her mouth with one hand. Grace's voice faltered, and a fit of coughing came over the speaker. Annie immediately stepped away from the group. Mom, sit up. Do you have your inhaler? I'm all right, Grace managed. No, you're not. I'm coming home. That is what I asked you to do 5 minutes ago. The faint edge of maternal scolding made Annie laugh once through her tears. Ethan said, I can have a car take her. No. Grace answered at once. Annie saw the offer wound him, though he had meant it kindly. Grace continued, My daughter arrived on her own. She can return home without owing a ride to anyone. Ethan nodded again. Understood. Victoria turned toward the waiting driver. Then this is finished for today. No, Ethan said. Annie paused with her toad in her hand. Ethan walked to the base of Daniel's grave. He looked at the wreath his driver still carried, then at Annie's small bouquet and wooden cross. Without ceremony, he took the expensive wreath and set it several inches away, leaving Annie's flowers closest to the headstone. This is not finished, he said. It is simply not going to be forced on Grace while she is ill. Victoria's eyes narrowed. What exactly do you think you are doing? Ethan kept his gaze on Daniel's name, learning that my brother's grave is not mine to guard from the people he loved. Annie lifted the phone back to her ear. Mom, I'm leaving now. Bring the coat home, Grace said. Annie looked at Ethan. He had not asked for it again. I will. She pulled Daniel's coat around her shoulders, picked up her tote, and began walking toward the road beyond the cemetery gates. Noah stepped aside to let her pass. Annie, Ethan called. She stopped, but she did not turn fully. I know I have no right to ask anything from you today, he said, but tell your mother I will not disturb her unless she permits it. Annie studied him for a moment. I'll tell her exactly what you said, she replied. What she does with it is up to her. Then she walked down the hill in the coat her father had worn, leaving Ethan beside a grave that suddenly told him almost nothing about the brother buried beneath it. Annie had almost reached the cemetery gates when the cold began to press through Daniel's coat. It was not because the coat failed to warm her. It was because her body had held itself stiff for so long in front of Ethan and Victoria that, once she was away from them, the shaking came all at once. Her phone was still in her hand. Are you still there? Grace asked. Yes, Mom. Are you walking to the bus stop? I'm leaving the cemetery now. Grace released a tired breath. Keep your scarf over your mouth. That hill catches more wind than the street. Annie swallowed against the ache in her throat. Even after everything, her mother was thinking about the wind. He recognized Dad's coat, Annie said. Grace was silent. He remembered wearing it when Dad kept him warm. Another silence followed, longer this time. I always wondered whether he remembered anything, Grace said. He didn't remember enough. No, Grace replied. Most people do not. When remembering would ask something of them, Annie stopped beside a bare maple tree, just outside the iron cemetery gate. Cars passed on the road below. their tires whispering over pavement darkened by morning frost. Why didn't you tell me they didn't know about us? Grace coughed before answering. Because you lost your father. I did not want you to lose your peace at the same time. I stood in front of his brother and had to prove Dad was my father. I know. No, Mom. You don't. Annie's voice cracked, and she hated herself for aiming pain at the one person who had never caused it. He laughed at me. He pretended to cry because I said Dad was mine. His wife looked at me like I was something that had crawled up the hill looking for money. Grace did not interrupt. Annie wiped her face with the back of her hand. I should have known before today. I should have known why my own father's grave didn't have our names on it. Yes, Grace said quietly. You should have. That was my mistake. The apology removed Annie's anger faster than any defense could have. Mom, I thought keeping you away from their judgment was protecting you, but I left you unprepared for it instead. Annie turned back toward the hill. From where she stood, she could still make out the figures by Daniel's grave. Ethan had not moved far from the stone. Victoria stood several feet away from him, rigid in her cream coat. Noah had his hands in his pockets, his head lowered. Ethan wants to come talk to you, Annie said. I heard him. What should I tell him? Grace's answer came after a labored breath. Tell him I will speak to him when I can sit at my own table without struggling for air. I will not have that conversation weak in a bed, and I will not have it at a cemetery. Annie understood. Grace had been made invisible for too long. She would not receive Daniel's brother as a helpless woman waiting for his decision. I'll tell him, Annie said. Come home first. I will. At the grave, Ethan watched Annie become smaller down the hill, until Daniel's old coat blended with the winter trees near the gate. Victoria waited until Annie was out of hearing distance before she spoke. You should call counsel before this goes any further. Ethan did not answer. He stood over the headstone, reading the inscription as if someone else had commissioned it. Beloved brother, a life given in courage. He had approved those words himself. At the time they had seemed dignified. Now they looked like the work of a man who had known one chapter of Daniel's life, and engraved it as though it were the entire book. Did you hear her mother? Noah asked. Victoria turned toward him. I heard a woman make serious claims during an emotional confrontation. You heard Aunt Grace, Noah said. Victoria's eyes sharpened. Do not start assigning family titles based on a phone call. Noah gave a bitter laugh. Based on a birth certificate? Based on Uncle Daniel's handwriting? Based on the coat Dad remembers being wrapped in? Based on verification, Victoria said. That is what responsible adults use before they allow themselves to be manipulated. Ethan finally turned. Manipulated into what, Victoria? She looked surprised by the question. Into accepting a stranger as Daniel's heir. Into exposing this family to a claim that could become public. Into making promises you may regret once you are thinking clearly. My brother had a wife who was too afraid to come to his grave, Ethan said. His daughter was standing right here, and I laughed at her. You were in shock. I was cruel. You were grieving. Do not make my grief sound noble when it behaved like prejudice. Victoria's face tightened. Noah looked at his father for a long moment, as though he had not expected honesty to arrive so soon. Ethan moved toward the flowers Annie had placed. One chrysanthemum had bent beneath the edge of the wooden cross. He crouched and lifted it carefully, straightening the stem against the stone. The driver still stood nearby holding the large lily wreath, uncertain whether to approach. Ethan looked at it. The ribbon read, To Daniel, my brother and my savior Ethan. Yesterday he had believed those words said everything necessary. Take that back to the car, he told the driver. Victoria stared at him. What are you doing? I will not cover her flowers with mine. Ethan, that is absurd. No. What was absurd was spending thousands of dollars arranging a beautiful memorial for Daniel while knowing so little about his life that his child had to introduce herself at his grave. Noah stepped beside the headstone. What happens now? Ethan looked down the hill, though Annie was gone from sight. Now I find out what my brother tried to build after he left us. Victoria shook her head. You do that through attorneys. I will verify every document properly. I will protect Annie and Grace from any future dispute. But I will not begin by treating them as suspects. Grace chose not to contact you. Perhaps she had good reason. Victoria gave him a long, disbelieving look. So this is how it will be? A girl arrives with a tragic story, and suddenly your wife is the enemy? Ethan's answer was quiet. No. You became the enemy in this moment when a sick widow and her child frightened you more than the possibility that we had wronged them." Victoria stepped back as if he had struck her. Noah reached into his coat pocket and took out his phone. "I can find the address of the church she mentioned. Decatur Baptist records may confirm the marriage." Ethan nodded. "Do that later." "Not here." He turned toward the headstone once more. His gloved hand stopped inches above Daniel's name before he removed the glove and touched the cold carved letters with his bare fingers. "I thought you were alone," he said under his breath. "I thought I was all you had left." The wind carried no answer, only the sound of branches moving above him. Noah stood close enough to hear. "Maybe," he said gently, "you weren't what he had left. Maybe they were what he was protecting." Ethan closed his eyes. At the roadside below the hill, Annie climbed onto the city bus with Daniel's coat buttoned tight around her and her mother still breathing softly through the phone. She did not look back again. She did not know that, behind her, Ethan Whitmore had just taken out his phone and called the cemetery office. "This is Ethan Whitmore," he said when someone answered. "Stop the engraving order for my brother's memorial plaque. The inscription is incomplete." The bus dropped Annie 3 blocks from the apartment complex just after noon. By then, the sky had turned a dull gray, and the wind had worked its way through the seams of Daniel's coat. She kept it buttoned anyway. Every time her hand touched the scorched shoulder, she remembered Ethan pulling it from the grave as if it carried dirt instead of her father's name. Grace had left the front door unlocked. Annie found her sitting in the recliner beside the window, the oxygen tube beneath her nose, a blanket over her knees. The dark blue dress she had tried to wear that morning was still on her body, wrinkled now, one stocking rolled halfway down her calf. On the coffee table sat the second cup of tea Annie had made before leaving. It had not been touched. Grace took one look at her daughter's face and lifted both hands. Annie crossed the room quickly and sank down beside the chair. Grace drew her close as best she could, one arm around Annie's shoulders, the other hand gripping the burned coat. "I am so sorry," Grace whispered. Annie buried her face against her mother's knee. She had held herself together on the bus because strangers were seated near her, because a little boy across the aisle kept looking at the flowers printed on her tote bag, because she did not want anyone to ask if she needed help. Now the tears came hard enough to make her shoulders shake. "He laughed at me, Mom." Grace closed her eyes. "He looked at Dad's coat and laughed. He said Dad never had a family. He made me feel like I was doing something dirty just by standing there." Grace's fingers curled into the canvas at Annie's shoulder. "He had no right. Why didn't Dad tell him about us?" The question hung between them. Grace leaned back slowly, taking 2 shallow breaths before answering. "Because long before you were born, your father learned what his family thought a proper life was supposed to look like." Annie wiped her cheeks and sat on the edge of the sofa across from her. "What does that mean?" Grace looked toward the framed photograph on the bookshelf, Daniel in a pale shirt with his arm around her outside a small brick church. "I met your father while I was working for his aunt, Miss Evelyn. She had arthritis so bad she could not button her own sweaters anymore. Daniel visited her every Thursday evening. At first, he brought groceries. Then he started coming early enough to sit in the kitchen while I made her dinner. Despite everything, the memory brought a faint warmth to Grace's face. He was not like the other people who came through that house. He asked my name before asking what I did. He noticed when I was tired. Once, he drove 40 minutes across town because I left my Bible on Miss Evelyn's table, and he knew I used it at church on Sundays. Annie had heard pieces of this before, but never what followed. When Daniel told his parents he wanted to marry me, they asked him whether he was trying to ruin his life. His father said a Whitmore man could have an affair with a woman like me and still recover, but he could not put a ring on my finger and expect to come home. Annie went very still. "He said that to Dad?" Grace nodded. Daniel walked out that same night. He came to my apartment with one suitcase and a bruise across his cheek where his father had struck him. Annie's lips parted, but no words came. "He never went back?" she asked at last. "Not to live, not to ask for money." He wrote Ethan a few times in the beginning. Daniel believed his younger brother might understand once he was old enough to think for himself. Grace looked down at her hands, but Ethan was already taking his place in the company. He answered politely once or twice, never asking the question Daniel was waiting for. What question? Why he left. Annie stared at the coat around her. Inside it were the names Daniel had carried without permission from anyone. So Dad decided Ethan didn't care. Your father decided he would not bring me. And later, You before people who had already made their choice clear. Grace's voice faltered. I did not argue with him. Maybe I should have. Maybe if Ethan had known about you sooner, he would have been different today? Grace did not answer. Annie understood. There was no way to know whether knowledge would have made Ethan kinder or merely given him more time to keep them at a distance. Her phone buzzed inside the tote. She reached for it, expecting a message from the pharmacy or her manager asking whether she could cover an evening shift. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. A voicemail appeared almost immediately. Grace watched her. Who is it? Annie played the message on speaker. Ethan's voice filled the small living room. Annie, this is Ethan Whitmore. I obtained your number from the cemetery office after telling them you had left personal items at Daniel's grave. I understand that was not entirely honest, and I apologize. I have stopped the order for Daniel's memorial plaque. Nothing further will be engraved until your mother has been heard. I would like permission to speak with her when she is well enough. I will not come to your home without being invited. The message ended. Grace's eyes remained on the phone. Annie expected her mother to dismiss it. Instead, Grace leaned back into her chair and closed her eyes, exhausted. He stopped the plaque, Annie said. So he said, do you believe him? I believe he is ashamed today. Grace adjusted the blanket over her knees. A person's shame is not the same as a changed heart. That takes time and action. Annie placed the phone on the table. Do you want to speak to him? Grace looked at Daniel's photograph again. Not today. Victoria said there would be lawyers. Of course she did. Grace's mouth tightened. People who have always had power like to make truth wait in a hallway until it fills out the proper forms. Annie almost smiled, but the ache in her chest remained too heavy. Grace reached out. Bring me the coat. Annie slipped it from her shoulders and placed it across her mother's lap. Grace opened the lining and ran her fingertips over the leather patch. He made this after you were born, she said. He told me a man ought to know what he was protecting when he walked out into the cold. Annie covered her mother's hand with her own. Ethan remembered Dad giving it to him. Grace nodded once, tears gathering quietly in her eyes. Then perhaps he is finally remembering the right beginning. A knock sounded at the apartment door. Annie rose at once, her heart jolting. Grace gripped the coat. Do not open it until you ask who it is. Annie stepped to the door. Who's there? A young man's voice answered from the other side. My name is Noah Whitmore. I know I should have called first. I brought back the cross from the grave. The wind knocked it over after you left, and I thought your mother might want it here tonight. Annie kept one hand on the doorknob and looked back at Grace. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. She was tired, still pale from coughing, but the old caution had returned to her face. Ask him if he is alone, she said. Annie turned back toward the door. Are you alone? Yes, Noah answered. I parked across the lot. My parents don't know I came. That answer did not make Grace more comfortable, but after a moment she nodded. Annie opened the door only halfway. Noah stood on the concrete walkway with the little wooden cross in one hand and a paper grocery bag in the other. Without his family beside him, he looked younger than he had at the cemetery. His navy coat was unbuttoned, his hair unsettled by the wind, and there was an awkwardness in his face that did not seem practiced. He held out the cross. I thought this should come back to you, he said, or go back to the grave whenever you decide. Annie took it carefully. A smear of damp soil marked one edge. Thank you. Noah glanced past her, then quickly lowered his eyes. I also brought soup. I know that sounds strange. I stopped at a deli on the way here, and then I nearly drove away because showing up with soup after what happened probably looks ridiculous. From the recliner, Grace spoke clearly enough for him to hear. It depends on the soup. Noah blinked. Annie looked back at her mother, surprised. Grace gave a tired motion toward the door. It is cold out there. Let him in before he loses the courage he came with. Annie stepped aside. Noah entered as though afraid of bringing the outside air too far into the room. He wiped his shoes on the mat and stood near the door with the grocery bag held in both hands. I'm Noah, he said to Grace. Noah Whitmore. I gathered that, Grace replied. You have Daniel's eyes around the corners. Noah looked startled. People usually say I look like my father. They say what they have been taught to notice. Annie placed the wooden cross on the coffee table beside Daniel's photograph. Noah saw it then, Daniel in shirt sleeves, smiling with one hand on Grace's shoulder and the other holding Annie as a baby. He stared for a moment before remembering his manners. I'm sorry for coming without asking, he said. I didn't have your number. My father only got Annie's by calling the cemetery office, and I didn't want to ask him for it. Why not? Annie asked. Noah shifted his weight. Because my mother would have heard about it within 5 minutes. Grace studied him. And you did not want your mother to know you came to see us? No, Mom. The answer was honest enough that Grace nodded toward the kitchen. Set the soup on the counter. Annie can warm it later. Noah carried the bag into the small kitchen. His eyes passed over the old table. The single empty chair pushed neatly under it. The pill organizer beside the fruit bowl. When he returned, he did not sit until Grace pointed to the sofa. Thank you, he said. Annie remained standing near her mother. Daniel's coat still lay across Grace's lap, the inner patch closed beneath her hand. Noah looked at it once, then away. My dad should never have said what he said, he began. I know that does not fix anything. I just didn't want you to think everyone standing there agreed with him. Annie's mouth tightened. You stood there too. I did. You told him to stop, but only after he had already done it. Noah accepted that. Yes. Grace adjusted the oxygen tubing beneath her nose. Annie is not responsible for making you feel better about what you witnessed. I know. Noah leaned forward, forearms on his knees. I came because I never knew Uncle Daniel had anyone, and because after Annie left, my father looked at that grave like it had changed in front of him. It did not change, Grace said. He simply stopped reading only the part that had his name in it. Noah dropped his gaze. Annie sat on the arm of Grace's chair. What happened after I left? My father stopped the new plaque they were planning to place by the grave. It was going to say Daniel gave his life for his brother. Noah glanced at Grace. He said no more words should be put in stone until you had been consulted. Grace's fingers moved once over the folded coat. That is a beginning. Nothing more. My mother is furious. That does not surprise me, Annie said. Noah hesitated. She thinks this will become a public issue. Or a legal one. Grace's expression did not change. Your mother believes truth becomes suspicious when it threatens comfort. Noah gave a small nod. My father told her she was talking about you as though you were a threat. She said he was letting guilt make decisions for him. And is he? Grace asked. Probably, Noah said, but I think he should feel guilty. The plainness of the answer drew a brief, tired smile from Grace. Noah reached inside his coat and removed a folded sheet of paper. There's something else. My father asked the family attorney for Daniel's old records. My mother objected, so I searched the public county records myself before I came here. Annie stiffened. You searched for us? I searched for the marriage record, Noah said quickly. I thought if I found it, nobody could say you invented anything. He held the paper out, not to Annie but toward Grace. Grace did not take it at once. Noah said, marriage license, DeKalb County, Daniel James Whitmore and Grace Elaine Carter. 19 years ago. I printed the public index page. It doesn't say anything you don't already know. I just thought you should know. I saw it. And I believe you. Grace stared at the folded page, then finally accepted it. For a long moment, the only sound in the apartment was the quiet pulse of her oxygen machine. When Daniel married me, she said, there were 4 people in that church. The minister, his wife, Daniel, and me. Daniel said 4 were enough if God was not taking attendance by family fortune. Noah smiled faintly. That sounds like him. You knew him? Not well. Once, when I was little, he fixed my bicycle at a family Christmas dinner. My grandfather was angry he had shown up. Uncle Daniel stayed outside most of the afternoon, working on my chain. He told me a wheel only runs straight when every link gets treated like it matters. Grace's eyes filled, but her voice remained steady. That also sounds like him. Annie looked at Noah differently then. Not with trust yet, but with the beginning of understanding. Daniel had touched his life too, even if only for an afternoon. Noah stood. I should leave before I make this harder for you. Grace folded the marriage record over the coat. Tell your father I will speak with him tomorrow afternoon, if my breathing holds. Annie turned to her. Mom, are you sure? No, Grace said. But your father has been buried without his whole name for a year. I do not intend to let fear make it too. Noah nodded. I'll tell him. At the door, Annie handed him nothing and offered no forgiveness. She only opened it for him. Before stepping out, Noah looked back at the photograph on the table. I wish we had known, he said. Grace answered him gently. but without letting the family escape the truth. Daniel wished that too, for a very long time. The next afternoon, Annie opened the blinds just enough to let winter light into the living room. Grace had slept badly, waking twice in the night, coughing hard enough that Annie nearly called the clinic. By morning, Grace insisted she was still meeting Ethan. "I can speak from this chair as well as any other," she said when Annie suggested postponing. "Your father did not marry a woman who hid every time a Whitmore came to the door." Annie helped her into the dark blue dress she had been unable to wear to the cemetery. Grace refused lipstick, then changed her mind, and asked for the rose-colored tube Daniel once bought by mistake, because he thought all lipstick looked the same. "He told me it made me look like I had just won an argument," Grace said, watching Annie apply it carefully. "Did you?" "Usually." For the first time since the cemetery, Annie laughed. It did not last long, but it eased something in the room. Daniel's coat lay folded across the back of the sofa. Beside it were the birth certificate, the photograph Noah had seen, the marriage record he had printed, and a small Bible with a yellowed ribbon, marking the page where Daniel and Grace had written their wedding date. At 2 o'clock exactly, a dark sedan stopped near the curb. Ethan got out alone. He was not wearing the heavy overcoat from the cemetery, only a dark jacket over an open-collared shirt. He stood beside the car for several seconds before walking toward the apartment, carrying no flowers and no briefcase. Annie watched through the window. "He came alone," she said. Grace adjusted the oxygen tube beneath her nose. That was the first respectful choice available to him. The knock was gentle. Annie opened the door but did not step aside immediately. Ethan looked at her. "Hello, Annie. Mr. Whitmore." He accepted the distance in her voice. "Your mother said she would see me." Annie moved back and let him enter. Ethan paused inside the small living room. His gaze went first to Grace, then to Daniel's photograph on the bookshelf, then to the coat folded on the sofa. In the silence, Annie could almost see him understanding that this was not a temporary place Daniel had passed through. His life was on every surface: a coffee mug with a chipped handle, a framed photograph of Annie in a graduation gown, a wooden side table repaired with a darker piece of oak where the original leg had broken. Grace did not attempt to rise. "Ethan," she said. "Grace." He stood awkwardly in front of her. "Thank you for allowing me to come. I did not invite you for your comfort." "No, ma'am." The respectful answer surprised Annie. Grace noticed it too, though her expression did not soften. "There is a chair," she said. Ethan sat on the edge of it, hands clasped between his knees. Annie remained beside the sofa, close enough to reach Grace if her breathing worsened. Ethan looked at Daniel's photograph again. "Noah told me he came here yesterday. He should have asked before appearing at your door. He brought back Daniel's cross," Grace said. "He also brought soup. I have forgiven the lack of warning." A small smile flickered across Ethan's face, then disappeared. "He told me he found the marriage record." "Yes. I should have looked for it years ago." Grace studied him. "Why would you have?" "As far as your family was concerned, Daniel had disappeared because he was difficult. That was easier than asking why a good man no longer wished to enter your house." Ethan took the words without protest. "I was 29 when he left. Old enough to ask." "I did not." "No," Grace said. "You did not." Annie expected Ethan to defend himself, to explain that he had been busy or caught between Daniel and their parents. Instead, he looked at his bare hands. "I knew there had been an argument," he said. "My father said Daniel was throwing his future away over a woman he barely knew. My mother said he would return once he came to his senses. I believed them because it cost me nothing to believe them." Grace's breath caught slightly. Annie reached for the water glass, but Grace lifted a hand to stop her. "Daniel knew me well enough," Grace said. "He knew how I took my coffee, how I hated thunderstorms, how I kept sewing buttons onto his shirts too tightly. He knew I wanted a child before I had the courage to tell him. Your parents did not object because he barely knew me. They objected because they knew exactly what I looked like." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. "I am sorry. For their words or for your silence?" "Both, though I know an apology does not change either one." Grace leaned back, conserving breath. "Daniel loved you." Ethan looked up quickly. He would not speak about the argument with bitterness. That made me angrier sometimes. "He kept a photograph of you both as boys in a fishing boat. When your company made the paper, he read the article twice. When Annie asked who you were, he said you were his younger brother and that life had carried you in different directions. He could have called me. He did, Grace said, twice after Annie was born. The first time, your assistant said you were unavailable. The second time, Daniel received a Christmas card from your office with your printed signature. Ethan's face emptied. I never knew. I believe you. Grace's voice was not cruel. That made the words worse. But a man surrounded by people whose job is to keep inconvenience from reaching him cannot be surprised when truth fails to get through. Annie saw Ethan draw a breath he could not seem to finish. Grace nodded toward the coat. The night Daniel saved you, he recognized your car near the State Park Road. You two had gone walking after meeting to speak privately. He told me he hoped the cold would cool both your tempers. Her eyes rested on Ethan. He came home without that coat, shaking so hard he could hardly turn the doorknob. He did not regret helping you. Not once. His last clear words to me were that his little brother was safe. Ethan pressed one hand against his mouth. I had asked him to meet me, he said. I wanted him to come to the anniversary dinner for our parents. I told him it was time to stop punishing the family. He told me he was not the one who had made love into an offense. His voice roughened. We walked because neither of us wanted the conversation to end that way. Then the weather turned, and I could not keep going. Grace looked down at Daniel's coat. He kept you going. Yes, and it cost him his life. Ethan did not look away. Yes, Annie felt anger rise again, but Grace reached for her hand before she could speak. Ethan turned toward Annie. At the cemetery, I said your father had no family. The truth is, I was the one who had no idea what family he had chosen. That ignorance was mine. What I did to you after that was mine too. Annie said nothing. Grace drew a careful breath. What do you intend to do now, Ethan? He glanced at the documents on the table, then at Daniel's coat. Whatever you and Annie permit me to begin correcting. Grace's hand tightened around Annie's. Then begin with the grave, she said. My husband will not lie beneath a stone that erases his child for one day longer. Ethan nodded slowly. Then the grave is where I will begin. Grace watched him with the caution of a woman who had learned that powerful people often became generous in the same moment they felt guilty, then changed their minds once someone advised them to. Begin does not mean promise it in this room and forget it after you leave. I understand. No, Grace said. I do not think you do. Daniel has been gone a year. Every time I pictured that stone, I knew it called him brother and nothing more. I stayed away because I could not stand there and see my marriage treated like it never happened. Annie went today because I failed her by letting my fear last too long. Annie gripped her mother's hand. You didn't fail me. Grace gave her fingers a small squeeze, then returned her attention to Ethan. I will not have my child turned into a scandal your family manages behind closed doors. I will not sign anything that asks her to keep quiet, and I will not accept money in exchange for pretending Daniel loved us in secret because we were something shameful. Ethan leaned forward. I would never ask that of you. You already assumed something about her this morning because of what she looked like standing at that grave. Grace's voice stayed even, but each word cost her breath. Do not assume what you are capable of when people around you begin telling you what would be easier. Ethan looked at Daniel's coat on the sofa. You are right. His phone rang in his pocket, the screen lit with Victoria's name. He silenced it without answering. Grace noticed. Your wife does not agree with you. No. Will that matter? Ethan took a moment before replying. It has mattered too much already. Annie glanced toward the kitchen. The soup Noah had brought sat unopened on the counter. The apartment smelled faintly of menthol from Grace's breathing treatment and the cinnamon candle Daniel used to buy when the weather turned cold. Ethan sat in the middle of that ordinary room like a man who had expected a secret to look suspicious and had instead found a home. What exactly happens to the grave? Annie asked. Ethan turned to her. The memorial plaque I ordered has already been stopped. The existing headstone can be replaced, or an additional inscription can be added if you and your mother prefer not to disturb what is there. I will ask the cemetery for both options. Grace shook her head. Replace it. Annie looked at her. Grace lifted her chin. It was wrong when it was placed there. We do not decorate around a lie just because the stone was expensive. A sound almost like a laugh escaped Ethan, but there was no amusement in it. Daniel would have liked that answer. He heard it from me often enough. For a second, Grace's face softened with the memory. Then her breathing caught. Annie rose immediately, took the nebulizer cup from the side table, and helped her mother adjust the tube. Ethan started to stand. "Should I call someone?" "No," Annie said. "Sit down. She needs calm, not an audience." He sat again without argument. Grace took several measured breaths through the mouthpiece while Annie rubbed her back. Ethan looked away, granting her what privacy a small room allowed him to give. When Grace could speak again, she said, "I am not dying this afternoon, Ethan. Do not look at me as if you have discovered another tragedy you need to arrange." A flush rose along his neck. "I apologize. You apologize often. I have had more reason today than most days." The phone rang again. This time Victoria's name remained on the screen until the call went unanswered. Almost immediately, Noah called. Ethan frowned and answered, "Noah?" His expression changed as he listened. "What do you mean she is at the cemetery office?" Annie looked toward Grace. Ethan stood. "No. Tell them not to process anything she brings them. I already instructed the office to hold the plaque." Noah's voice was audible only as a worried murmur through the phone. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I do not care what she told them. Daniel's next of kin has not been fully recorded. Nothing changes until Grace and Annie approve it." Grace went very still at the sound of their names. Ethan listened again, then said, "I will handle your mother. Stay there until I call back." He ended the call. "What is she doing?" Annie asked. Ethan slid the phone into his pocket. "Victoria went to Coatℹ. She is trying to have the memorial plaque installed as planned before I can formally withdraw the authorization." Grace gave a tired, unsurprised breath. "There it is." Annie stared at Ethan. "Why would she do that?" "Because once the plaque is installed, she believes reversing it will look like a public admission that the family hid something." "You did hide something," Annie said. "I did not know about you. You knew enough this morning to try to keep me away." Ethan took the words without flinching. "Yes." Grace removed the breathing mouthpiece and placed it carefully on the table. "If your wife thinks a stone set in the ground can keep my daughter outside Daniel's life, she has mistaken delay for victory." Ethan reached for his coat. "I need to go to the cemetery and stop her." Annie rose. "I'm coming." "No," Grace said at once. "Mom, she's trying to put another marker beside Dad's grave that leaves us out again. You have already been hurt enough for one day. And if I stay here while they decide what his grave says, I will feel hurt every day after this." Grace looked at her daughter's face. Annie was still wearing Daniel's coat. The scorch mark on the shoulder seemed darker against the fading afternoon light, like proof of a burden that had passed from father to child before either of them was ready. Ethan said, "Annie does not have to fight this. I will stop Victoria." Annie turned toward him. "That is exactly what everyone keeps deciding for us. Dad chose silence because he thought he was protecting Mom. Mom chose silence because she thought she was protecting me. And your wife is counting on us staying quiet because that protects her. I am done being protected out of my own family." Grace closed her eyes. Pain moved over her face, followed by recognition. After a moment, she reached toward the side table. "My purse." "Mom?" "My purse, Annie." Annie handed it to her. Grace took out a small silver ring attached to a thin chain. She had worn it beneath her dress for as long as Annie could remember. "This was Daniel's wedding band," Grace said. "He could not wear it on some construction jobs, so I kept it safe when he worked. The night he died, it was still around my neck." She placed the chain in Annie's palm and closed her daughter's fingers over it. "Take it with you," Grace said. "If they require one more proof that your father loved us, let them look at the ring he came home to every night." Annie bent and kissed her mother's cheek. "I'll be back soon." Grace looked past her to Ethan. "Bring my daughter home safe." Ethan nodded, but Grace stopped him with a raised hand. "Do not answer me like a man receiving an honor. This is a responsibility. Daniel gave his life keeping you from the cold. Today you begin proving that his child is not left standing in it." Ethan lowered his head. "Yes, Grace." Annie followed him outside. The air had grown colder, and the first faint flakes of sleet tapped against the parked sedan. As Ethan opened the passenger door for her, his phone rang again. "Victoria." This time he answered. "Ethan," Victoria began, "before you overreact, I am trying to preserve Daniel's dignity." Ethan looked across the roof of the car at Annie in her father's coat. "No," he said. You are trying to bury his wife and daughter while there is still room on the stone for the truth." Sleet struck the windshield in fine, sharp grains. As Ethan drove back toward Coatℹ, Annie sat stiffly in the passenger seat, Daniel's coat buttoned to her throat. Her fingers closed around the silver wedding band Grace had placed in her palm. The heater pushed warm air toward her boots, but she could still feel the cold from the cemetery in her bones. Ethan ended the call with Victoria and set his phone face down in the console. For several blocks, neither of them spoke. Atlanta traffic moved slowly under the gray sky, brake lights glowing red along the wet road. Annie watched office buildings and strip malls pass beyond the glass, wondering how many times her father had driven these same streets without ever turning toward the family that had buried him. Ethan cleared his throat. "Your mother should not have had to send you back out into this." "She didn't send me," Annie said. "I chose to come." "I know. Do you?" He kept his eyes on the road. "I am beginning to." Annie looked at his profile. In the cemetery, Ethan had seemed larger than the hill itself. The kind of man whose anger made other people step aside. Now his shoulders appeared bent beneath the weight of the steering wheel. "You said Dad met you that night," Annie said. "Why?" Ethan's hands tightened at 10 and 2. "Our parents had been gone several years. I wanted Daniel at a family dinner we were hosting in their memory. I thought enough time had passed." "Enough time for what?" "For him to stop being angry." Annie turned toward the window. "You mean enough time for him to forget what they did to my mother?" "Yes," Ethan said after a pause. "That is what I meant, though I did not call it that at the time." The direct answer left Annie with nowhere to aim the anger that had been ready in her mouth. Ethan continued. "Daniel agreed to meet me near Sweetwater Creek because he did not want to come to my house. We walked along one of the trails and argued. I told him he had wasted years punishing people who were no longer alive to apologize. He said I was asking him to return to a family that had never apologized to the woman who was still alive." Annie lowered her eyes to the ring in her hand. "Then the sleet began," Ethan said. "The trail markers were hard to see. I wanted to keep going rather than admit we should turn back sooner. We ended up off the path. I was wearing a dress coat and loafers because I had come from the office. Daniel called me an idiot for dressing like a board meeting in November woods." A weak smile touched his mouth and vanished. He was right. He usually was. Ethan looked briefly at her, then back at the road. "You sound like him when you say things plainly." Annie did not know whether to accept that as kindness. "What happened after you got lost?" "I became confused. My hands stopped working. Daniel tried to guide me, but I fell twice. When I could not get up the second time, he took off his coat and wrapped it around me." His voice dropped. "I remember him holding my face between his hands and saying I was going to walk because he had someone waiting for him at home and he was not letting me make him late." Annie's fingers tightened around the ring. "He meant us." "Yes," Ethan swallowed. "I did not ask who he meant. Even then, I thought every important thing in his life had to somehow lead back to me." The sedan turned through Coatℹ's iron gates. The sleet had thinned, leaving the stone paths wet and shining. Ahead, near the cemetery office, Victoria's cream coat stood out beside 2 grounds employees and an older administrator holding a clipboard. Noah waited several feet away, his phone in his hand, relief crossing his face when he saw Ethan's car. Annie unfastened her seatbelt before Ethan had fully stopped. "Stay close to me," he said. She turned sharply. "I am not afraid of your wife." "That is not what I meant." "Then do not say it like I need permission to stand there." Ethan gave a small nod. "You're right. Stand wherever you choose." Annie opened the door and stepped into the wet cold. Victoria saw her first, then Ethan, and her expression hardened. "You brought her back?" Victoria asked. Ethan walked around the car. "Annie came because this concerns her father. It concerns Daniel's memorial, which was planned and paid for before any of this appeared." "Before the truth appeared," Noah said. Victoria ignored him and turned to the administrator. "Mr. Halpern, my husband is upset. The family approved the plaque weeks ago. There is no reason to halt installation because of an unverified claim made in the middle of a graveside visit." Annie drew the chain from her pocket. Daniel's ring swung once in the cold air before settling against her palm. "My mother sent this," she said. Victoria glanced at it. "A ring is not an answer." "No," Annie said, "but it belonged to my father, and my mother wore it on a chain because he could not keep it on while he worked. She should be here telling you that herself, except her lungs are failing and this family made her afraid to visit her own husband's grave." Mr. Halpern lowered the clipboard slightly. Mr. Whitmore, there appears to be a dispute over the memorial wording. Our policy would be to pause any additional installation until next of kin documentation is reviewed. Then pause it, Ethan said. Victoria turned to him. You are allowing a stranger to interrupt your brother's commemoration. Ethan's face remained steady. Her name is Annie Rose Whitmore. She has Daniel's birth entry as her father. A marriage record identifying Grace as his wife. His coat with their names cut into the lining. And the wedding band he wore during the life I failed to know about. None of that has been formally authenticated. Then it will be. Ethan took a step closer. But no stone is being placed here while his wife and daughter are treated as an inconvenience. Victoria's voice lowered. Do you understand what this could do? People will ask why Daniel hid a wife and child. They will ask what kind of family never knew. They will ask what else has been kept quiet. Annie watched Ethan. For a moment, she saw how easy it would be for him to retreat behind those questions. Men like him had whole rooms built for avoiding shame. Instead, Ethan said, then we will answer them truthfully. Victoria gave a disbelieving laugh. You are prepared to drag the Whitmore name through the mud for a girl you met this morning? Annie's face warmed despite the cold. Ethan looked at her before answering Victoria. I dragged it through the mud myself when I mocked her at Daniel's grave. The cemetery administrator cleared his throat. I will record the plaque order as suspended pending amended instructions from the legally confirmed family representatives. Thank you, Ethan said. Victoria's eyes flashed. Legally confirmed family representatives? I am Daniel's sister-in-law, and Grace is his wife, Ethan replied. Annie is his child. You do not outrank them in his death simply because you refuse to see them in his life. Victoria went silent. Noah came to stand beside Annie, not too close, simply present. Is your mother all right? She is waiting at home. She should not have to wonder what happened here. Annie nodded. She lifted her phone and called Grace. When her mother answered, Annie put the call on speaker. Mom, she said, her voice unsteady but clear. They stopped the plaque. Grace breathed quietly on the other end. Ethan stepped nearer, but not close enough to take the phone from Annie's hand. And no marker will be approved, he said, until you decide what your husband's stone should say. Grace was silent for several seconds. Then she replied, it should say he was loved by the family he came home to. Ethan closed his eyes. Annie looked past him toward Daniel's grave at the top of the hill. The little cross was no longer there, and the flowers she had placed that morning were too far away to see clearly. Still, for the first time since Ethan's shout broke her prayer, she did not feel as though she was being pushed away from her father. Victoria turned and walked toward her car without another word. Ethan watched her go, then looked at Annie. I cannot undo this morning. No, Annie said. You cannot. But I can stop it from being the way this family behaves tomorrow. Annie held his gaze for a moment before lifting the phone back to her ear. Mom, I'm coming home now. Grace's voice softened. Bring your father's coat. Annie touched the scorched shoulder. I still have it. Good, Grace said. Some things belong with the people who know what they mean. The drive back to Grace's apartment was quieter than the drive to the cemetery. Annie kept the phone in her lap after the call ended, watching the sleet soften into a cold rain on the passenger window. Daniel's wedding band remained looped around her fingers. She had shown it to people who should never have needed proof that her father had loved her mother, and now the ring felt heavier than silver should feel. Ethan did not turn on the radio. At a red light, he said, I should take you straight home and leave you with your mother. She has had enough Whitmore presents for one day. Annie looked at him. She needs to know what happened without hearing it through me while I'm still angry. You have every right to be angry. That doesn't mean I want to frighten her. Ethan nodded. Then I will tell her plainly, if she allows me inside. When they reached the apartment complex, Annie saw Grace waiting behind the living room window. The oxygen tube was still beneath her nose, and Daniel's dark blue blanket had been pulled around her shoulders. She looked smaller than she had when Annie left, but her eyes were alert. Ethan parked at the curb and stayed in the car while Annie walked up the short path. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately went to her mother. It's done, Annie said. They stopped the plaque. Grace closed her eyes for one brief moment. And you? I'm all right. Grace touched the scorched shoulder of Daniel's coat. That is not the same as saying you were treated rightly. No. Annie knelt beside her chair and placed the silver ring back into her mother's hand. But I didn't have to stand there alone. Grace looked toward the window. Ethan was still seated in the car, both hands resting on the steering wheel as if he would not move unless summoned. He brought you back? Yes. Did he expect to come in? He said he would only if you allowed it. Grace turned the ring over between her fingers. He is learning quickly today. Do you want him to come in? Grace took a careful breath. I do not want another night to pass with him free to imagine that stopping one plaque has repaired what happened. Annie rose and opened the door. Ethan saw her gesture and got out of the car. Rain dotted his jacket by the time he reached the threshold. Grace, he said from the doorway. May I come in? You may. He stepped inside and remained standing until Grace indicated the same chair he had used earlier. The room had grown darker with the weather, and Annie switched on the lamp beside Daniel's photograph. Its light fell across the folded marriage record on the coffee table and the cedar box still open near the sofa. Ethan looked at Grace. The cemetery has formally suspended the plaque. Nothing new will be placed at Daniel's grave until you and Annie approve the wording. Grace nodded. Thank you for stopping your wife. The sentence held no gratitude beyond the act itself. Ethan seemed to understand. Victoria will not make any decisions concerning Daniel's memorial. Can you guarantee that? Yes. The cemetery has my written instruction, and tomorrow I will have an attorney notify them that Daniel's surviving spouse and child must be included in any decision. Grace's gaze sharpened. An attorney chosen by you? For the cemetery notice, yes. For your rights, no. You should have counsel who represents only you and Annie. I will pay for it without directing it, if you permit me. Annie expected her mother to refuse immediately. Grace studied him instead. If the money becomes a leash, I will cut it. It will not. That is not a promise you make once. It is a choice you will have to make every time this becomes uncomfortable. Ethan folded his hands. Then I will make it every time. Grace settled back against the chair. Her breathing was shallow, but there was strength in the way she held his eyes. What did Victoria say when you stopped the plaque? That public questions might damage the Whitmore name. And what did you tell her? That we would answer them truthfully. Grace gave the smallest nod. Daniel would have appreciated that more than a wreath. Annie moved into the kitchen, not because she wanted to leave the conversation, but because the soup Noah had brought was still sitting on the counter. She poured it into a saucepan and turned on the burner. The ordinary sound of a spoon against a pot steadied her after a day of people arguing over whether her life belonged to the truth. Ethan looked toward the kitchen. Noah brought food? He brought Daniel's cross back too, Grace said. He came without permission, but with decent intentions. He gets that from Daniel more than from me. Grace's expression shifted, not quite softening. Do not make yourself smaller now, to appear humble. Annie does not need to comfort you through your regret. Annie paused with the spoon in her hand. Ethan nodded. You are right. A coughing spell came over Grace before she could answer. Annie hurried back with water, helped her mother lean forward and waited while she caught her breath. Ethan rose halfway from his chair, then stopped himself from intruding. When Grace recovered, she said, Daniel spent years making certain my illness never became Annie's whole childhood. He took overtime when I needed treatments. He learned every medication. He sat beside me during the bad nights and made jokes so she would not hear fear in our bedroom. She glanced at her daughter. He was not only the man who kept you alive in the cold. I know that now, Ethan said. No, you have been told it now. Knowing him will require listening to the daughter who had him for 18 years. Ethan turned to Annie. She remained beside Grace, one hand resting on her mother's shoulder. What do you want the stone to say? He asked. Annie looked at her mother. Grace did not answer for her. I wanted to say he was her husband, Annie said. I wanted to say he was my father before it says anything about what he did for you. Ethan received the words without resistance. It will. And I don't want some ceremony where your family acts generous for admitting we exist. There will be no ceremony unless you and your mother want one. Grace lifted Daniel's ring from her lap. There should be one. Not for the Whitmores. For Daniel. A man should not be corrected in secret after being misremembered in public. Annie looked at her, surprised. Grace's eyes were wet now, but she did not look away. I spent a year mourning him behind a locked door because I was afraid of the people standing on the other side. I will not ask my daughter to keep doing that. Ethan lowered his head. Grace continued. You may arrange a new stone. You may invite whoever needs to hear the truth. But Annie and I approve every word before it is carved. Yes, Ethan said. Every word. From the kitchen, the soup began to simmer. Annie went to turn off the stove, blinking back tears as she reached for bowls. Her mother had not grown suddenly well. Ethan had not become family simply because guilt had brought him through their door. Victoria had not disappeared, and neither had the cruelty on the cemetery hill. But Daniel's name would no longer stand alone above an incomplete life. As Annie carried the soup into the living room, Grace touched the burned coat around her daughter's shoulders. "Keep wearing it," she said. Annie glanced at Ethan. Grace followed her gaze. "Not for anyone to recognize. For yourself. Your father put our names inside that coat before anybody else decided whether we belonged." Ethan looked down at the floor. Annie sat beside her mother, the old canvas sleeve brushing Grace's hand. For the first time that day, the coat did not feel like evidence. It felt like home. 3 days later, a padded envelope arrived by certified mail. Annie signed for it at the apartment door, while Grace watched from her recliner, an Afghan tucked around her legs and the oxygen concentrator humming beside her. The return address belonged to a law office in downtown Atlanta. Annie carried it to the coffee table but did not open it. "Do you want me to call Ethan first?" she asked. Grace shook her head. "It has my name on it. Open it here." Inside was a short letter from an attorney named Margaret Ellis, stating that she had been retained to represent Grace and Annie independently, with all fees placed in trust by Ethan but no instructions permitted from him. Attached were certified copies of the DeKalb County marriage license, Annie's birth record, and a preliminary petition recognizing Grace as Daniel's surviving spouse and Annie as his lawful child for all matters concerning his estate and memorial. Grace read the marriage license slowly, one finger resting beneath Daniel's signature. "He signed this in a suit he borrowed from the minister," she said. "The sleeves were too short, and he kept tugging them down in every picture." Annie smiled despite herself. "You never told me that. There are many things I thought I would have time to tell you when remembering did not hurt so much." A knock sounded at the door. Annie looked through the peephole and saw Ethan standing outside with Margaret Ellis, a silver-haired woman holding a leather folder. Grace adjusted herself in the chair. "Let them in." Ethan entered last, waiting while Margaret introduced herself and took a seat near Grace. He did not behave as though he owned the room or the process. Annie noticed that. She also noticed she was keeping track. Margaret explained each document in plain language. Daniel and Grace's marriage had been legally recorded 19 years earlier. Annie's legal status was clear. Daniel's remaining personal estate, which had been assumed to pass through Whitmore family arrangements, could not be finalized without recognizing his wife and daughter. Grace listened without celebration. "I do not want to fight over money to become the story of my husband," she said. Margaret nodded. "That is your decision. My work is to ensure you are not denied rights simply because you choose dignity over conflict." Ethan looked at Grace. "No one will deny you anything again." Grace met his eyes. "That sentence is too large for any one man to promise." He lowered his gaze. "Then I will say only what I can do. I will not oppose you. I will not allow my office, my wife, or anyone using my name to oppose you without answering to me." Before Grace could respond, Ethan's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and silenced it. Annie saw the name, Victoria. Margaret noticed too. "Mr. Whitmore, there is another matter. This morning, Mrs. Whitmore's counsel contacted my office with a proposed private resolution." Ethan went still. "I did not authorize that. I assumed as much, which is why I brought it directly here." She removed a document from her folder and placed it on the table. Annie read only a few lines before the language tightened her stomach. "Confidential acknowledgement. Financial payment. No media contact. No public allegation of exclusion or discrimination. Memorial matters to remain subject to Whitmore family approval." Grace did not touch the paper. "How much does she think silence costs now?" she asked. Margaret answered carefully. "A significant amount." Grace gave a low, tired laugh. "It always is, when the buyer has never had to live with the silence." Annie turned to Ethan. "Did you know about this?" "No, but she thought she could do it." His face darkened. "Yes." The front door opened after a quick knock. Noah stepped inside, rain on his jacket and anger in his face. "I'm sorry," he said to Grace. "Dad, Mom told me she had made an offer and said it was for the good of the family. I came as soon as I could." Ethan picked up the proposed agreement and read enough to understand it. Then he folded it once, set it back on the table and called Victoria. She answered immediately. "I assume you have seen the proposal." "I have. It is generous, Ethan, more generous than any court would require, and it protects everyone from a spectacle." Grace looked toward Annie but said nothing. She did not need to. Ethan replied, "Withdraw it. Do not be reckless. This girl's appearance has already changed Daniel's estate. The least we can do is keep it from changing the family name." Noah shook his head, disgusted. Ethan's voice remained controlled. "Annie is not an appearance. Grace is not a complication. They are Daniel's family. And what does that make us? It makes us the people who were wrong." Victoria was silent. Ethan continued, "Any further communication with Grace or Annie goes through Miss Ellis unless they choose otherwise. You will not offer them money for silence. You will not represent yourself as speaking for me on Daniel's memorial. And you will not attend any service for Daniel unless Grace and Annie invite you. You are excluding your wife for strangers." Grace's eyes moved to Ethan. He answered, "They stopped being strangers the day Daniel married Grace. I was simply late learning it." He ended the call before Victoria could reply. Noah let out a breath and sat in the chair nearest the door. "I am sorry she did that." Grace looked at him. "You are not responsible for your mother's choices. You are responsible for what you do after seeing them clearly." Noah nodded. "Then I'm here." Margaret opened another folder. There is a draft inscription from the cemetery stonecutter. "Nothing is final. They need your wording." Annie came to sit beside Grace. The paper contained polite language, carefully spaced, but Grace crossed out the first proposed line immediately. "Not beloved member of the Whitmore family," she said. "That sounds as though we are still asking their permission." Annie took the pen when her mother handed it to her. She wrote slowly, "Daniel James Whitmore, beloved husband of Grace, devoted father of Annie, brother, protector, and the man who gave his warmth so another could live." Ethan read the words without speaking. Grace looked at him. "Your place in his story is there, but it comes after the life he came home to." "It should," Ethan said. Margaret collected the signed approval and placed it in her folder. "The new stone can be completed within 4 weeks." Annie looked at the coat folded beside her mother. A month earlier, she would have thought 4 weeks sounded too long. Now she understood that stone took time because words meant to last should finally be right. Ethan rose to leave. At the door, he paused. "Grace, Annie, I would like to arrange a memorial service when the stone is ready. Not a press event. Not something for the company. Only the people Daniel loved, and anyone you believe should hear the truth." Grace looked at Annie. Annie said, "He deserves to be named correctly in front of people, not corrected in private." Grace nodded. "Then we will be there." After Ethan, Noah, and Margaret had gone, Annie returned to the sofa and opened Daniel's coat so the leather patch caught the lamplight. Grace touched the carved names with the tip of her finger. "For years," she said, "I thought keeping quiet was the same as keeping peace." Annie leaned against her shoulder. "It was not peace, baby," Grace whispered. "It was only pain that had learned not to speak." Outside, the rain moved softly against the window. Inside, for the first time since Daniel died, his wife and daughter were no longer waiting for someone else to decide whether their names belonged beside his. 4 weeks later, Annie stood in front of the apartment mirror while Grace sat behind her in a straight-back chair, conserving her breath for the trip ahead. The morning sun had no warmth in it yet, but it brightened the room enough to catch the faded brown of Daniel's coat and the black mark across its shoulder. "You don't have to wear it if it feels too heavy today," Grace said. Annie ran her fingers over the repaired cuff. "It doesn't feel heavy." Grace studied her daughter's reflection. "No, it feels like Dad is going with us." Grace smiled, and for a moment illness lifted from her face. "Then button it properly. He never could stand to see somebody go out in the cold with an open coat." Annie fastened the buttons while Grace reached for the small velvet box beside her purse. Inside was Daniel's wedding band on its silver chain. Since the day Annie had carried it back to the cemetery, Grace had worn it outside her dress instead of beneath it. This morning, it rested in plain view against the navy fabric Daniel once told her made her look too beautiful for an ordinary Tuesday. A car horn gave one soft tap outside. Noah had arrived in a borrowed wheelchair-accessible van rather than sending a driver. When Annie helped Grace through the front door, he stepped out in a dark suit, and opened the side ramp himself. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. Grace paused at the surname. It was the first time he had called her that. "Good morning, Noah." He smiled nervously. "I hope that was all right." "It was accurate," Grace said. "Accuracy has become important to us." Noah gave a small laugh and helped secure the wheelchair. Annie took the seat beside her mother, while Ethan waited for them at Coatℹ. He had offered to send a car, but Grace preferred arriving with Noah. "He comes without trying to decide where I ought to sit," she had told Annie. "That is a useful quality in a young man." When they reached the cemetery, the hill looked different without the gathering of expensive vehicles and arranged grief Annie remembered from her first visit. There were only a dozen people waiting near Daniel's grave. Margaret Ellis, Mr. Halpern from the cemetery, a few older members of Grace's church, Daniel's former neighbor who had driven in from Macon, and Reverend Samuel Price, the minister who had married Daniel and Grace 19 years earlier. Ethan stood a short distance from the covered headstone. He wore a plain charcoal suit, no overcoat despite the cold, and held no prepared wreath. When the van stopped, he came forward, but he waited until Annie had lowered the ramp, and Grace nodded before approaching her chair. "Grace," he said, "thank you for coming." Grace looked toward the white cloth covering Daniel's new stone. "I have waited too long not to." Ethan turned to Annie. His eyes settled briefly on the coat, then met hers. "You look ready for the weather. My father taught me to be." He accepted the answer with a small nod. There were no reporters and no company representatives. Victoria had not come. Noah had told Annie the night before that his mother considered the service an unnecessary humiliation. Annie had felt no triumph hearing it, only relief that Daniel's grave would not become one more place where someone tried to make Grace defend her marriage. Reverend Price began with a short prayer. His voice was low and steady, familiar enough that Grace's shoulders eased as she listened. "Lord, we come not to rewrite a life, but to speak fully of a life that was always whole in your sight. May truth be given without pride, sorrow held without shame, and love named where it should have been named from the beginning." Annie took her mother's hand. Ethan stepped in front of the small group. He held a folded page, but after looking at it once, he returned it to his pocket. "My brother saved my life in the cold 1 year ago," he began. "For 12 months, I believe that fact gave me a full understanding of Daniel's goodness. It did not. It gave me the part of his life that concerned me." Grace kept her eyes on the covered stone. "Daniel was my older brother. I loved him. I also failed him long before the night he saved me. When our family rejected the woman he married, I accepted distance instead of asking what wrong had been done. When he was gone, I honored him as if the only family he had ever loved was mine." Ethan looked at Annie. "The first time I met his daughter, she was kneeling at his grave in the coat Daniel once used to save me from the cold. I saw her clothing, her grief, and the color of her skin, and I decided she did not belong here. Before I knew her name, before I knew she was my niece, I treated her as less worthy of respect than the stone she was praying beside. No one shifted. No one offered him relief. I was wrong," Ethan said, "not because Annie turned out to be family. I was wrong because she was a human being, and I chose contempt before kindness." Annie felt Grace's fingers tighten around hers. Ethan drew a breath. "Today is not about my regret. It is about Daniel James Whitmore, whose life deserves to be remembered truthfully. He was not a solitary man, whose story ended when he saved his brother. He was Grace's husband. He was Annie's father. He loved them, came home to them, and carried their names against his heart." He stepped away from the stone. Reverend Price nodded to Annie and Grace. Noah gently rolled Grace's wheelchair forward until she could reach the edge of the white covering. Annie stood beside her, the sleeve of Daniel's coat brushing her mother's hand. "Together," Grace whispered. They each took a corner and pulled. The cloth slid from the stone and fell softly across the winter grass. Daniel James Whitmore, beloved husband of Grace, devoted father of Annie, brother, protector, and the man who gave his warmth so another could live. Grace did not cry at first. She lifted one hand from her lap and placed her fingertips on the word husband, her breath trembling through the oxygen tube. "There you are," she whispered. Annie placed her palm beneath the word father. "Hi, Dad." Only then did Grace begin to weep. Annie bent beside her chair, and Grace pressed her forehead to her daughter's temple the way she had when Annie was small and scraped her knees on the sidewalk. Behind them, someone sniffed quietly. Reverend Price lowered his head. Noah turned away for a moment and wiped his cheek with the heel of his hand. Ethan stood apart, giving Grace and Annie the center Daniel should have given them all along. When Grace finally lifted her face, she looked toward him. "He loved you too," she said. Ethan's eyes filled. "I know. I wish I had understood what that love asked of me sooner." Grace glanced at the inscription. "Justice arriving late does not return what was lost." "No," Ethan said, "but it keeps the loss from being repeated." Annie looked at her mother, hearing in those words every year Grace had spent believing silence was safer than being seen. Noah approached with 3 white chrysanthemums in his hand. "I thought simple flowers might be right." Annie smiled slightly. "They are." He handed one to Grace, one to Annie, and placed the third at the foot of Daniel's stone. Annie laid hers beside it. Grace touched her flower to her lips before letting Annie place it for her. The group began to disperse slowly, leaving small words of comfort and warm handshakes for Grace. Reverend Price promised to visit the apartment with Peach Cobbler once she felt strong enough for company. Margaret Ellis told Annie the legal papers had been filed that morning, then left without burdening the moment with more details. Ethan remained near the path until Annie turned toward him. He looked at the coat again. "Daniel wore that for years before I ever understood what it meant." Annie smoothed the scorched shoulder. "It meant home before it meant saving you." Ethan nodded. "You are right." Grace reached for Annie's hand. "Come, baby. Your father has his name back. Let him rest with it." Annie bent once more and touched the headstone. As Noah guided Grace toward the van, Annie followed in Daniel's old coat. The burn mark was still there. The patched cuff still showed. Nothing about it had been polished for the day. It did not need to be. On the hill behind them, the stone finally told the truth. By early March, the bare oaks above Oakhaven had begun showing small green tips, and the patch of ground around Daniel's grave had lost the hard look of winter. Annie noticed the change from the bus window before she reached the cemetery stop. She had not come back since the day the new stone was uncovered. Grace had wanted to return sooner, but her lungs had decided otherwise, and Annie had refused to leave her alone during 2 weeks of new treatments and restless nights. That morning, Grace had been sitting upright by the apartment window with a blanket over her knees and a cup of weak, sweet tea in her hands when she gave Annie permission to go. "Tell him the treatments are helping," Grace said. "I will, and do not make me sound helpless." Annie had smiled. "I never could." Grace pointed toward the envelope on the coffee table. "Take that too. Your father would want to know." Inside was Annie's acceptance letter for the Emergency Medical Technician Training Program at Atlanta Metropolitan Community College. She had applied without telling Ethan, not because she still wanted distance from him in every matter, but because this decision belonged first to her and Grace. Ethan had already done more than either of them expected. Margaret Ellis completed the legal recognition of Grace as Daniel's surviving spouse and Annie as his daughter. Daniel's remaining assets were modest compared with the Whitmore fortune, but they were his: a small retirement account, insurance money no one had explained to Grace after his death, and the value of the pickup truck that had been sold while she was too sick and grief-stricken to ask questions. Ethan saw that everything owed to Grace and Annie was returned through Margaret's office, without calling it a gift. He also paid for a specialist to review Grace's care, but only after Grace made him say aloud that medical treatment did not purchase forgiveness. Since then, Ethan had learned to call before visiting. He brought groceries once, received a lecture from Grace for buying peaches in winter, and returned the next week with canned peaches and a pound cake from a neighborhood bakery she approved of. Noah came more often. He sat at the kitchen table helping Annie study anatomy flashcards. And Grace claimed Daniel would have been delighted to see one Whitmore finally learning something useful. Annie stepped off the bus wearing Daniel's coat. Spring had made it almost too warm for the heavy canvas, but she wore it anyway. The scorched shoulder was still dark. The repaired cuff had loosened, and Grace had promised to mend it when her hands felt steadier. She carried 3 white chrysanthemums, the acceptance letter, and a new photograph of Grace sitting outside the apartment in the sunshine, her oxygen tank beside her and Daniel's ring visible over her sweater. At the grave, Annie placed the flowers beneath the stone and brushed away a fallen leaf. Daniel James Whitmore, beloved husband of Grace, devoted father of Annie, brother, protector, and the man who gave his warmth so another could live. "Hi, Dad," she said. "Mom says not to worry about her. That usually means she wants you to worry a little. Just not enough to make a fuss." She placed Grace's photograph against the base of the stone. She sat outside yesterday, almost 20 minutes. She complained about the neighbor's wind chimes, so I think she's feeling more like herself. Annie sat on the grass, careful not to crease the envelope in her hand. For several moments, she listened to the breeze moving through the trees and the distant sound of a groundskeeper's cart. I got in, she said at last. The EMT program. Classes start in May. Her voice tightened unexpectedly. I know it isn't the same as what you did. You did not need a certificate to walk into the cold after somebody. But I kept thinking about how Mom said you always knew what to do when someone was scared. I want to know what to do too. She opened the envelope, looked once at the acceptance letter, then folded it again and held it against her chest. She had almost placed it beneath the flowers, but stopped. Her father did not need her future left at his grave. He had worked for it so she could carry it away. A car door closed near the path. Annie turned and saw Ethan walking toward her alone. He wore a brown jacket and carried a small bunch of daisies, not lilies. He stopped several feet away. I did not know you would be here, he said. That makes two of us. Would you prefer to be alone? Annie glanced at the stone, then shook her head. You can come over. Ethan approached and placed the daisies beside Annie's chrysanthemums. Daniel used to bring those to our mother, he said. She complained they were common. He kept bringing them anyway. He brought grocery store flowers to Mom, Annie said. She complained roses were a waste of money. Ethan smiled faintly. He was consistent. Annie handed him the photograph of Grace. She wanted Dad to see it, but you can look first. Ethan held it carefully. She looks stronger. She is. Some days. I'm glad. Annie nodded toward the envelope. I was accepted into an EMT program. Ethan looked up, surprised and pleased, but he did not immediately offer money or connections. He seemed to catch the old instinct before it came out. Congratulations, he said. Daniel would be proud. I think so too. They stood in silence for a while. It was no longer the strained silence of the apartment or the wounded silence of the first morning at the grave. It did not ask either of them to pretend the past was repaired. It simply allowed them both to miss the same man. Ethan glanced at Annie's coat. You are still wearing it. It still keeps me warm. His eyes lowered to the burned shoulder. It always did that better than I deserved. Annie looked at him. The words were not a request for reassurance, and for that reason she answered honestly. My father did not save people because they deserved it. He saved them because that was who he was. Ethan nodded. Then I owe him a life that remembers that. You do. The breeze lifted Annie's hair across her cheek. She tucked it back, then bent and touched the word father on the stone once before standing. I need to get home before Mom decides I have caught cold in a cemetery and sends Noah after me. Ethan smiled. Would you like a ride? Annie considered it, then nodded. You can take me home. They walked down the hill together, not as strangers and not yet as people who knew exactly what family would look like from here. Annie carried her acceptance letter under one arm and wore the coat with her parents' names hidden safely inside it. The canvas was scorched, the cuff was patched. It would never belong in the polished world Ethan had once tried to protect from it, but Daniel had never worn it for display. He had worn it home. This story reminds us that a person's worth is never determined by their clothes, their skin color, their income, or whether they belong to a powerful family. Annie deserved respect before anyone learned her name or her connection to Daniel. Ethan's regret shows that prejudice can wound innocent people before the truth ever has a chance to speak. Justice cannot return the years lost to silence, but it can begin when people admit their wrongs, restore the dignity they denied, and choose compassion over judgment. Daniel's old coat teaches the final lesson. What looks worn and unimportant to the world may carry the deepest love, sacrifice, and truth. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.